Okay, so welcome everyone to our April Conservation Conversations. We're really excited to have you join us. My name is Mikkel Benfield. I'm an AmeriCorps member serving with Harpeth Conservancy. I'm going to go ahead and give you all a brief intro and background on Harpeth and the work that we do and introduce our speakers for tonight's event. So to begin, Harpeth Conservancy, we are a science-based conservation organization here in Tennessee, and our vision is to promote clean water and healthy ecosystems for the rivers, and most importantly, have that cause be championed by all of you, the people who live here. So our goal is that the rivers of Tennessee meet required federal and state water quality standards. And the way in which that we work towards this goal and the vision we have in mind can be summarized through this really neat RIVERS acronym. We implement and promote river restoration projects. We find pollution issues and strategies and solutions to address them. We also hope to ensure that everyone in the community has access to the decision-making process and a platform for their voices to be heard, as well as educating the communities that live here and promoting responsible recreation. And most importantly, we make sure that all the work that we're doing, our advocacy and programming, is founded in science. In addition, our programs and our goals and our vision can be put into 4 different categories. Those are clean water protection, community engagement, science and restoration, as well as rural protection and land use. So in order to be able to fulfill our programming and achieve these goals that we have for clean waters in the state, it's important that we have financial support as well, and your donations are greatly appreciated and encouraged. Our current campaign is called Cheers to Our Earth. Given the past flooding events here in Tennessee in March, we have been participating in and planning flood recovery efforts. So in order to accommodate these cleanups that were kind of unprecedented and unbudgeted, we have a goal of raising $10,000 by May 6th. So we would greatly appreciate anything that you're able to give. If you're able to pledge $50 or more, you'll receive a shot glass, $1,000 or more, a ticket to our river spring. And this, again, it supports these flood recovery efforts, our water quality science research, as well as our education and outreach programs.
A shot glass for $50.
There you go. So one of the programs you'll be supporting is our more hands-on and in-person events. These are called Lessons on the River. We are incorporating into this particular program all of our flood cleanup efforts. So we have one coming up on May 1st and one on May 15th. We had a couple of really successful cleanup efforts already in April, one in Bellevue, one in Richland Creek. So we really encourage all of you to come out and participate in these ones we have next month at Hidden Lake and Flat Creek. We'd really appreciate it. And in June, we have more of a continuation on the topic we're discussing today, but this time we're transferring it to more hands-on experience at Bates Nursery, discussing native plants and pollinators. And in July, we have our annual Family Fun Day. Additionally, we have Conservation Conversations, another program you'd be supporting through donations, as well as to fulfill our mission. And these are what we're participating in right now, these virtual discussions, and we hold them every month, fourth Wednesday, always at 6 p.m. And the topics vary, and we invite experts to come on in and share with us their expertise and have a discussion with us. Coming up in May, we have flooding in Tennessee, which will cover, past historic events, what happened in March, what happened in May 2010, and then look forward. What are some adaptive solutions and strategies we can put in place? In June, we will be talking about dams and their impacts. And then in July, we'll be discussing emerging water quality issues in Tennessee. So besides our programming, there are other ways you can take action with Harpeth Conservancy. You can plan your own cleanup and volunteer. You can use our water reporter app. You can even sign up for a specialty license plate. And so a portion of the proceeds, if you do sign up for this license plate, do go to Harpeth Conservancy and the programming that we do. So if you're interested, please reach out to any of our staff or visit riverplatetn.org to get more details on that. And finally, why we're all here this evening, it's to hear from our experts and have a conversation with them to discuss invasive and native species of Tennessee. Tonight we have joining us Murray Gheesling. He is a Middle Tennessee Stewardship Ecologist with TDEC. And we also have Cooper Breeden, who is a Plant Conservation Manager at Southeastern Grasslands Initiative and Conservation Coordinator at Tennessee Plant Conservation Alliance. So we'll first be hearing from Murray, and then followed by Murray, we'll be hearing from Cooper. And while Murray, he can go ahead and start sharing his screen. And while he does that, I'll go ahead and give you guys a short background and introduction to Murray. So Murray, you can go ahead and share your screen. So Murray, he graduated from the University of Tennessee at Martin with a master's degree in natural resources management. He served as a Tennessee State Park Ranger at Hiwassee, I'm gonna pronounce this wrong, Ocoee Rivers State Park for 9 years and at South Cumberland Savage Gulf for 3 years. He has been with Tennessee Division of Natural Areas for 3 years as a stewardship ecologist for Middle Tennessee. In his current role, he implements management plans for state natural areas using fire, herbicide, and mechanical methods so our rare plants and ecosystems can thrive. All right, so Murray, take it away.
All right, thank you, Mikkel. Really grateful to be able to present with the Harpeth Conservancy. Enjoyed your summary and particularly the hands-on stuff, very cool. So the Division of Natural Areas manages state lands designated as state natural areas. And this designation is usually because of rare plant species or a rare ecosystem type that exists on the land. And although they can be large places like Savage Gulf, more often they're just a couple hundred acres or less. Tonight, I'll be discussing some common invasive species problems that we encounter on state natural areas and methods we use to address those problems, and hopefully relate what we do to some useful techniques for the homeowner as well. So I know you're probably up to speed on invasive plants, but to avoid confusion, we'll just define an invasive plant species. This is my mended and condensed definition here. So generally, when we talk about invasive plants, we're talking about non-native or exotic species which were introduced to a habitat without the evolutionary checks of pests and disease they evolved with in their own ecosystem. These plants are by far the biggest problem. That's what an invasive plant is. But it's not always the case, especially if we're talking about land management terms for rare species. Sometimes you can have a case where a natural characteristic such as fire is excluded from an area for an unnatural amount of time. And so trees like red cedar in our glade areas or red maple in our wetland areas quickly become invasive, although they are native trees, and they alter the integrity of the area that we are protecting. So we do selective treatment for these species as well. And I should also mention that most non-native species are not an invasive problem. Most of our crop and garden species are non-native, but lack the tenacity to become an invasive problem. So how did they get here? Well, there are 3 main reasons for the invasive introduction, and often the most troublesome plants involve all 3, or at least 2 of the 3. Calorie pear, for instance, was introduced as a way to combat the fire blight disease in pear trees in California, which was a huge catch crop in the early 20th century. So by grafting fruit production trees with this other non-native species, the trees were not susceptible to fire blight. A couple decades later, it was developed as a horticultural tree, the Bradford pear, and initially it was thought to be sterile, but it was able to cross-pollinate with other slightly different cultivars to produce viable seed and to spread. So there are all 3 of those processes right there. Others like the aquatic Hydrilla verticulata They were introduced as ornamental or aquarium plants. And even privet was considered an ornamental plant at one point in its introduction. These next few slides are going to highlight our main players for what we deal with in natural areas in terms of invasives that we combat. And it also highlights the main three threats associated with invasive plants. The first is loss of biodiversity. It's the main one we focus on. And this is where an invasive plant, well, to sum it up, where an invasive plant grows is where a native species has been displaced. And when we're talking about more than a few plants, it's a real habitat change for everything that relies on the displaced native plant. Insects, birds, mammals, water quality and aquatic wildlife can be affected. And infestation can alter pollination of native plants and alter the hydrology of an area. And it can end the regeneration of whole ecosystems like rare grasslands and glades and the endemic plants in those systems. This is a picture of privet at Overbridge State Natural Area and Lespedeza at the Columbia Glade in the Duck River Complex State Natural Area. Economic loss is the next threat. So real estate values can decline, particularly with infestations of calorie pear or privet that become expensive to control. Some plants can become a fire hazard to homes or forests when it becomes a monoculture of flammable plant material. This second picture is microstegium, something we combat often. And this is occurring in a rare plant habitat at Langford Branch in a Xyris seep, Xyris tennesseeensis being the rare plant that's threatened by it. And the human health is the next threat associated with invasive plants, mainly because it limits outdoor recreation opportunities such as hiking and boating, fishing, hunting, and bird watching. And not only does it limit, I guess, physically provides a barrier to these activities, but it can limit interest developed in pursuing these activities as well. Invasives can produce an overabundant pollen that causes allergic reactions, and there is a correlation between mental health and the health of our environment. So what do we do to protect our native plants and ecosystems and control invasive species that threaten them? We have three main tools to use, and the most effective protection is a combination of all three: herbicide, fire, and mechanical methods. And this picture is wavy leaf coneflower at Flat Rock State Natural Area, a somewhat rare plant. Herbicide. So there is a whole world of herbicides, and getting started can be very intimidating. We try to keep it pretty simple. In this picture, Jeremy is treating individual plants with a backpack sprayer at May Prairie State Natural Area. And these are the three main herbicides that we use. Glyphosate is a non-selective herbicide we use for direct target application in the early growing season. And this allows any overspray spots to revegetate, hopefully with native plants during the growing season, so it doesn't miss a season. Triclopyr is a woody broadleaf selective herbicide, and we use this for Lespedeza cunita and most everything else we treat. Mostly we use this as a foliar spray, and that's wetting the leaves of the plant with a backpack sprayer or tank sprayer. We also use an oil-based version of this that can be sprayed directly on the bark or painted on the bark of a shrub or tree. And that's a good option when the leaves are too high to spray effectively, wind drift affecting that, or during the dormant season. And Sethoxidem is a grass selective herbicide, and we use that to treat Microstegium and Arthraxon. Here, Alan is treating Lespedeza cunita with Triclopyr along with, it's along an interior road at Dry Branch State Natural Area. And just out of the frame is a UTV and a tank sprayer. We add blue dye to help identify what has been sprayed and what has not. And here Sam is using a foam applicator to apply herbicide directly to Lesbedeza stems and leaves. And there's some nice gray-headed coneflower in this photo and some common milkweed. Nice plants, not rare, but especially the milkweed, conservation concern. As I mentioned, much of our work involves managing for rare plant species, so that can look quite different when we talk about herbicide treatment. Herbicide is mixed, in this case, with a foaming agent and applied using a special foaming sprayer. It comes out about the consistency of shaving cream and remains on the plant until it's dissolved. It reduces the collateral damage of herbicide dripping to the ground. And the lower right picture is Dahlia foliosa, a federally endangered plant that often grows in the same areas that Lesbedeza cunita or our Thraxon, an invasive grass, have invaded. The top right picture is Pine's ground plum. Astragalus bibulatus is another federally endangered plant that grows in more gravelly glade areas, and we spend a lot of time managing the habitat for these plants. Here's just a photo of what that foam looks like a little bit closer, and a photo of treatment in action in the field and the type of habitat that we're talking about for Dahlia foliosa. And this is the type of habitat that Pine's ground plum likes. It's a gravelly, glady area. So we have less direct competition from invasive species among the plant, but our main concern with that is the encroachment of woody species along the line here. Given time, leaves and needles will cast off and build up soil, and this tree line will creep ever more steadily into this glade area and effectively choking it out and putting these glade endemic plants at risk. So we deal with that through fire. We use fire to help manage for native species by reducing the competition and staving off woody succession. That's the growth cycle of the forest, from woody saplings getting established to a shrub layer, mid-story trees, up to a canopy layer. As mentioned before, fire is a natural event that has been suppressed actively through ad campaigns. So think like Smokey the Bear and the fire is bad narrative, and passively restricted through increased infrastructure like roads acting as fire breaks. Although it can look like a dramatic event sometimes, most of our native plants have evolved in this landscape and they're fire tolerant. Unfortunately, fire is not a one-step answer to the invasive problem. As many invasives are also fire tolerant, but it can knock them back and clear grass or leaf litter, and then allow an opportunity to pull or treat them when they're weaker or most vulnerable. Here's what it looks like on one of our fires. This one is at Flat Rock State Natural Area. The idea of prescribed fire can be intimidating, like the world of herbicide, but it's also not out of reach for homeowner application. If we're talking about burning an area in your backyard, you don't have to have the special boots and clothes. Jeans will do just fine. All you really need is good fire lines and good weather that's low humidity, but not dangerously low, and a steady low wind. A permit from the Division of Forestry, your county forestry office, and tools like rakes or hose as a contingency. For larger areas, the Division of Forestry offers prescribed fire as a vendor service at a reasonable rate. Our final management practice is mechanical, so pulling and cutting. And I lumped the cut stump and the hack and squirt method in here as well. Although those are herbicide applications, they still involve a mechanical means. And here, a leverage tool is being used to pull a shrub up by the roots, the best way to prevent resprout. Mechanical is often much more labor intensive, but that's okay. Here, a forestry mulcher is at work at Cedars of Lebanon, and it's clearing some cedar trees off what once was a barren, but has become choked by cedar trees over time. And here is fire on that same area, eliminating that cedar mulch and allowing sunlight to hit the soil and plants to sprout. Of course, mechanical work is much easier if you have help. This is an AmeriCorps team that worked with us for about a month and a half. They're decked out in fire gear here, but they ran chainsaws quite a bit, cutting some of those cedars, those woody encroaching areas. Treatment considerations, seasonality, plant phenology, that is the life cycle of the plant. When does it emerge? When does it reproduce? When does it start storing energy for dormancy? Scope of the problem. It's going to make a difference if we're talking about a small area or large area, your desired result. If staving off the woody encroachment is all you're after, then fire will do. But if you're wanting to eliminate Lesbedeza from a trail, then something else will need to be done. Site characteristics like its proximity to water is a factor. We don't spray any sort of herbicides along stream banks, whether the label says they're aquatic safe or not. We treat them as if they are not. And we track our results. Here, we use this app where we're able to map our locations of treatments. Each dot pulls up a survey with a narrative of what we did. But for the homeowner, simply before and after pictures are good enough. And in conclusion, these are some resources that are helpful. The first is our Natural Areas website. We have events throughout the year, a big 50th coming up. I encourage you to check that out and find an event that you might like to participate in. The second is Tennessee Invasive Plant Council. A lot of great information for homeowners, including native plant landscaping guide, lots of information on specific invasive plants and how to treat them. Also invasive.org, it's a nationwide database similar to the TN IPC. The Division of Forestry wildfire site, and lastly, my email address. If you have any questions you don't want to ask at the end of this, after Cooper's talk, feel free to email me and I'll be happy to address those. Lastly, this is a passion flower, Passiflora incarnata, a native wildflower, one of my favorites. That wraps me up. I'll turn it back over to you, Michaela.
Thank you, Murray. That was really awesome, really informative. We have a lot of questions in the chat, so everyone feel free to put them in there. We'll get to the discussion at the end of the event once we hear from Cooper. So Cooper will be speaking next. You can go ahead and start sharing your screen, and I'll give a quick introduction to Cooper's background. So Cooper Breeden is the Plant Conservation Manager at Southeastern Grasslands Initiative and the coordinator for the Tennessee Plant Conservation Alliance. Most of his work revolves around rare species and habitat conservation in grassland ecosystems. This involves coordinating restoration and protection efforts where the plants occur, as well as curating a rare plant seed bank to preserve the integrity of each rare plant population. These seeds can then be used in future conservation efforts, either for use in introduction projects or to plant in safeguarding plots in botanical gardens. Part of Cooper's role is to work with a variety of partners and volunteers to accomplish this work. All right, so Cooper, go ahead.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here. I'm glad to be sharing the stage with Murray. I work with Murray and a lot of his coworkers on a regular basis. So I'm going to talk about native plants and their use and significance in our ecosystems. I'll spend just a, all right. Are you on the next slide now? Can you see the Southeastern Grasslands Initiative slide?
Yep, yeah, we see it.
Cool. All right, so I'm going to just talk really briefly about the organizations I work for. So I work for the Southeastern Grasslands Initiative, or SGI. We're based out of Austin Peay State University in Clarksville. I myself am based in Nashville. But our goal is to protect and preserve grassland ecosystems throughout the Southeast. We have a broad definition of what the Southeast is, as you can see by this map here. It includes at least a part of 24 different states. One of my roles and why I was initially hired and kind of transitioned into my role at SGI is to coordinate this other thing called the Tennessee Plant Conservation Alliance, which is less of an organization and more of just a network of different organizations and agencies and individuals that have an interest and want to play a role in rare plant conservation. So that's just one of the things that I do within SGI. So most of my work that I do at my job has to do with rare plant, rare species conservation projects. Hence why I work with Division of Natural Areas and Murray and his colleagues a lot. So I'll talk about native species now, getting into it. What is a native species? So here's a definition for you. An organism that occurs naturally in the region in which it evolved. It's something that's adapted to the biotic, which is the living, and the abiotic or non-living factors of that region. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that definition in a little bit. This is a rare plant we have in Tennessee called the Tennessee Trillium. Only occurs in a few sites in East Tennessee. So I'll talk a little bit more about what a native plant is and more aspects of that definition in a second, but wanted to talk also about why native plants are important. So I'm sure you guys are all familiar with what an ecosystem is in some way, just a community of living organisms and all the non-living components interacting as a system. So native species in general, native plants and animals are kind of the biological building blocks of an ecosystem. And so it's an ecosystem really relies on all of those different native species interacting together. Native plants specifically, their role in these ecosystems, they have a lot of different roles, but they're the foundation of the food web. And so different animals and even some plants rely on them to survive. So whether it's pollinators or other insects using them as a nectar source, or other mammals, insects, or other creatures using them, eating their seeds or fruits or leaves. But they're also an important habitat component for ecosystems. And this photo is a quail. This is the focus of a lot of conservation attention in the Southeast. There's a lot of quail habitat restoration. So a lot of native plant restoration is done not just for the sake of native plants, but also for the animals that depend on these native plant ecosystems. This is another example. This is in the bottom left there. It's a yellow form, a species of Baptisia. It serves as the host plant for this butterfly, this really rare butterfly called the frosted elfin. It's a candidate for federal listing. This butterfly depends on this and just a few other species that the caterpillar have to need these plants to live. And this plant itself is dependent on a very specific ecosystem that you see in the right here. Kind of this open grassland, savanna, woodland kind of ecosystem. This Baptisia, it's not rare, but it's something that's highly susceptible to human impact. And so once you get exotic or invasive or even just native weedy species in there, it tends to drop out of that ecosystem pretty quick. So just an example of showing this interaction of all these different organisms working together. Some more reasons why native plants are important. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with ecosystem services. Climate change is obviously a big problem internationally. So native plants, whether it's forests or grassland systems, serve as a method for carbon sequestration. And so these plants take in that carbon and it serves as a carbon sink to hopefully reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. And then you guys are, I'm sure all of you are familiar with the different water conservation benefits that plants serve, whether it's in a rain garden or a retention basin or as erosion control in a stream bank stabilization project. Plants serve a lot of different factors there, a lot of different roles there. If you're planting plants either in a garden or a rain garden or some sort of landscaping project, depending on the species and assuming you're choosing the right species, they tend to be more low maintenance. Don't have to water them as much because they're adapted to the environment, to the area where you're planting them. Of course, they have an aesthetic value. This picture on the right, it kind of serves a lot of these different factors that we're talking about, a lot of these benefits, but this is just in a suburban yard. And this one guy, he's actually an author. He wrote a book called A New Garden Ethic. He's converted his into just this prairie paradise on his little like 1/4 acre lot. And as Murray mentioned, there's health benefits. Being out in a natural system, one that is a healthy and balanced ecosystem, there's multiple health benefits associated with that. So going back to this definition of what is a native species. So I defined it as an organism that occurs naturally in the region in which it evolved. So I want to talk about what is a region. So there's a lot of definitions, and there's not just one definition, and it really kind of depends on where you're coming from. But a political boundary is obviously a way to define a region, whether it's a state or something smaller like a county, or it could be something much more broad like the United States or the Eastern United States. But there's also these other concepts, which I'll talk about just very briefly. But I'm sure you're familiar with these plant hardiness zone maps. This is especially something that gardeners or people involved in agriculture would be aware of. But this is a map that these zones you can see colored by these regions color coded. These are defined by the minimum winter temperature. So that's one way to define a region. Another way is ecoregions. This is something that has been developed by the Environmental Protection Agency, federal agency. We have a lot of different ecoregions throughout the US. This is the US, and then here's our ecoregions in Tennessee. Someone might define a native plant as something that is just native and has adapted to specifically their ecoregion. So in Middle Tennessee, that all those different orange colors, that could be the interior plateau, or you might want to get really specific and talk about the Nashville Basin or the Western Mountain Rim. And so an example of that, so I tend to be, in most cases, a little bit of a purist when I define what is native. And so I'll talk specifically about a plant that occurs in a state might not be native to the whole state, but could be just native to a part of it. And so an example of that is this one, the bald cypress. You can see its distribution map, those light green counties there. Technically, you might only consider it, or depending on your perspective, you might only consider it native to West Tennessee. It doesn't naturally occur in Middle Tennessee or East Tennessee. Although it is commonly planted in different like stormwater projects or rain gardens or things like that. And so it does serve a purpose, and it has a benefit. Because it's not native to Middle Tennessee, I don't know that that's problematic. I personally don't really think that there's any issue with planting this in Middle Tennessee. It really just depends on your perspective and how much of a purist you want to be. I don't really have an issue with, even though it might not be Middle Tennessee, I don't really have an issue with planting it in Middle Tennessee or elsewhere. There's this other concept of seed zones. And so this is kind of a mix between the plant hardiness zones and the ecoregions, and it creates these, here's Tennessee zoomed in, it creates these smaller pockets. And so these were developed for using locally adapted seed and restoration. And so let's see, so for those of you who might be working either in your garden and wanting to use native plants in gardening or rain garden, or even in broader like native habitat restoration projects, you probably ask yourself the question, like, how do I know it's native? What region is it native to, and where do I get it? So you have species like this. These are just two examples. Brown-eyed Susan on the left and little blue stem on the right. You can see from their distribution maps that they're very widely distributed. And so no matter what definition you're using of native species, these are probably going to fit that bill. No matter where you are, you're going to be able to call them native, whether you're using a small ecoregion or a seed zone or a broader United States or Eastern United States definition. But that, I want to get into these, I'm going to tie that into some of these best practices now. So this first one here is using regional ecotypes. So whether you're gardening or doing habitat restoration, as much as possible, it's ideal to use regional ecotype. And that just means a geographic variety of a native species. And so going back to this slide, if you want to incorporate black-eyed Susan either into your pollinator garden or whatever you're using, ideally you would try to find the regional ecotype. So rather than using black-eyed seed, rather than buying a seed pack that you got order from Michigan, it's more ideal to use the regional ecotype and try to get it sourced from Middle Tennessee or maybe one of the neighboring states and try to get it as local as possible. And there's several reasons for that. There's genetic concerns, not as much with these common species, but sometimes with less common species, there are genetic concerns where you don't want to mix these different populations and possibly create this invasive genotype. But there's also practical concerns where if you're planting a black-eyed Susan from Wisconsin down in Middle Tennessee, it might not be as well adapted and it might not be as successful. And so it is practical to try to use regional ecotype. Quickly going through these others, if you're buying native plants, try to use responsibly sourced material. There's plenty of native plant nurseries, and there's a couple in Tennessee throughout Tennessee that I think are responsible ones. I can give recommendations at the end. But there are some that also are known to not be responsibly sourced, where they're known to go out and poach these plants and dig them up in the wild, probably without permission or without the appropriate permits. And so you always want to check on that. You could ask at the nursery, or you can check on the plant tags and make sure they're nursery propagated. Let's see, use seeds and plants that are adapted to a project. So whether you're doing a garden or doing a native plant restoration, like a meadow or a stream bank stabilization, try to use plants that are adapted to that habitat. So you don't want to use like a wetland plant and plant it in like a dry upland area where it'll require constant maintenance or just be doomed to fail if you don't give it a lot of attention. Avoid nativars. This is so some of these best practices are things that I just came up with. These didn't come from one best practices guide or a specific protocol. I just kind of accumulated these as my own best practices. This avoid nativars is one that could be controversial. But here, this is an example of nativars on the right. So you have the purple coneflower, and that top picture is the native natural variety of the purple coneflower. But horticulturists have developed these other varieties to select for certain features of these plants for a lot of different reasons. I'm not sure why this one variety in the bottom right was selected, but it looks like maybe it was just a unique showy version of this. But there's a lot of science that says that these nativars can be, even though they're native species, technically they can be detrimental because they don't, like for example, they could not be as valuable as a pollen resource for pollinators. But there's a lot of different aspects there where these nativars can maybe not be invasive, but kind of serve the same niche as an exotic species. Avoid rare species. This is because I work in rare species conservation. I do follow best practices in rare species projects. In general, avoid rare species because you want to make sure you get the right seed source for these rare species. But it could get to a point where, depending on where you're planting these or how near to a native population there are, you could get to a genetics issue where you start creating these population hybrids that could lead to a situation where the natural population might not do as well. And then don't clean up too much in the dormant season. So a native plant garden or a pollinator garden, they're not just there for the flowers. These plants provide a habitat for a lot of these insects or other species. And so a lot of them will make homes in the dead standing material of these plants. And so if you have a native plant garden, don't just mow it down at the end of the season, or don't mow all of it down, but leave some standing material in there for some of the insects that might use this as a home. And then these are just some resources. I didn't put links in here, but I can share those and maybe they could be emailed out to everyone that participated. But there's just a few for trying to figure out what plants to select and the appropriate habitats. I have a few links here. And then these are just some native plant books that have been really useful to getting into the whole native plant scene. But that's all I got.
Thanks so much, Cooper. I know we've got a bunch of questions. Is Mikkel still around?
I am here. My internet survived.
Okay.
We have a really great chat going on. You guys have a lot of questions. And we have about 15 minutes to kind of, talk about as much as we can. So we can start up at the beginning and hopefully we'll be able to address everyone's concerns or questions or interests. And also feel free to just chime in. So first we have the concern, moreover, of using herbicides of any kind. Or like what are common concerns that people may have? What are common misconceptions of herbicides? For example, glyphosate.
Yeah, very popular topic. So I guess some common concerns would be namely health concerns and using it in an inappropriate way, a way that that could cause harm to you or your environment. So that's a big hump to get over for sure. And organizations like that Invasive Plant Council, they tailor instruction to homeowners to get over that kind of hump of worry. So that I would just recommend visiting those sites, doing a little research. That Tennessee Invasive Plant Council is great. And I'll just move down the list to the next question. Feel free, if I don't answer your question effectively, to let me know. The best way to kill privet from resprouting, I would say, would be the cut stump method, where if you're cutting down large privet, you immediately treat it with herbicide. Glyphosate works, and it would be the cheapest of your options if we're talking about a large area. Triclopyr is a woody selective herbicide that will be effective on privet as well. The key is to do it fairly quickly after you cut it. Otherwise, that wound that's left from cutting can essentially scar over and prevent an effective absorption of the herbicide. Also, something about that cut stump, if you recall the photo that I had in there was just a ring around the edge. That's just the cambium layer, the xylem and phloem of the stump. It doesn't need to be drenched. You don't need to get any in the soil or anything like that. It can be very targeted and minimal herbicide use.
Can you type the names of those two that you mentioned?
Sure.
Thank
They're
you.
kind of the active ingredients of a lot of, this is Dory. I forget now, I've got them all in my garage, like triclopyr is an active ingredient of a lot of like weed be gone and black and glyphosates. And am I correct? Is that Roundup or not?
Right. Glyphosate is like your Roundup, and just 100 other kind of knockoff brands contain the active ingredient of glyphosate. Triclopyr would be like your brush cutter.
That's it. I
yeah.
couldn't remember it. Yeah.
Right. That's a popular triclopyr product. But those are the active ingredients. So there are some glyphosates, when we're talking about considerations for the area where you're going to be treating, that have an ingredient that might not be aquatic safe. Glyphosate itself as a chemical is fairly benign and not really soil active, not toxic to fish, but a lot of the agents that are also mixed in with the herbicide are. So that's a consideration when you're choosing your herbicide. Same thing with triclopyr. We don't spray it in the water and treat it as toxic, but it has a very low toxicity in an aquatic environment. And
I want to say something about the herbicide for people that have a concern with it. I mean, I think that I can totally sympathize with people that have concerns with using herbicide just from just hurts inside to have to use herbicide. But I would say just from managing a lot of our native habitats and native communities, a lot of them are dwindling, and a lot of the species in there are dwindling because of these invasive species. And so I think the task is just too large to tackle the problem of invasive species without using herbicide. And I think we've gotten to a point where at this point, there's really no other option if we're going to save some of these native habitats and plant communities.
Yeah, that's well said, Cooper. And it's an accepted professional practice for many years now, as far as treating invasive species. So there's a question about invasive blackberry. Triclopyr is a woody selective, and that would work on blackberry. Getting it cut, I'm not sure if it's able to be mowed or what, but getting it cut and then treating the resprouts would be the most effective use of herbicide. And that may take a few rounds, a few seasons to knock that back.
I want to chime in because Murray and Cooper are bringing up something very important. Because my husband and I have been basically following the kind of professional guidance and what's it like to be a homeowner and do this, like clear privet. It is a annual, and it's not, you don't go out one day for 3 hours and spray shit and it's taken care of. It is a process, manual mechanical removal. And so reading those labels and being thoughtful about how to use it. I think unfortunately most people don't realize that removing exotics is like someone was saying, hey, how can we work with Franklin to remove all the privet along the roadway? If we don't replant something else, it's going to come back. So there's so much privet already blowing around. So invasive removal is a big project that we can all do, but we have to do it on the regular. And that's the challenge, because it's a bit of work. I mean, it's muscle. I don't know if Murray and Cooper have anything else they want to add into it, but I think the more we're aware of it, the more we can be helpful as property owners.
Yeah, and I'd like to chime in. This is Jane. Dory's absolutely correct. I've worked with invasive plant removals on a number of sites, and it's not a one and done. This is something that you have to keep after. And it's just, as Dory said, just be cognizant and read the labels and spray it where it's needed, and as opposed to a mass spraying of just anywhere and everything.
Right. Yeah. Very rarely is there's any sort of broadcast spraying. There has never been in my professional capacity with Division of Natural Areas. So that's not really what we're talking about. And that's what a lot of the environmental problems that hit news headlines come from is agricultural use of herbicides versus this restorative use of herbicides is what we're talking about. And the difference is night and day. I would also add that, yes, it's not a one and done, but I wouldn't want that to be a barrier to getting started either, because depending where you are, you can see some results on the first round, so there are other areas that are full of privet, like Stones River National Battlefield. I mean, they've got great staff, and boy, they consistently battled privet, and they've been doing it for many years. But there's other places where you hit it once and you'll be able to see the difference. And that's where, I guess, getting a baseline, keeping track of your applications with before and after photos is important. That can help encourage you to keep going.
This is kind of funny, but once you know what you're pulling in the spring, if you're on a telephone call, just go out there and pull the little baby Nandinas while you're on the phone. In 3 hours, you're done. What part of it's getting savvy about time of year for someone that once you recognize it, and it's not all that hard, and you do a bit at a time. So there's a lot of cool stuff in the chat, and there's a lot of great resources too.
There's one that I'd like to hear the answer to. Julie says, what is the best way for someone with limited botany background to learn how to identify invasive versus native species?
I'll try to answer that. I think the best way for someone that doesn't have a lot of knowledge in plants in general, I think the best way is to start with like a wildflowers book. The most popular one, or most thorough one maybe, is I think it's called The Plants of the Ohio Valley, which includes a lot of Tennessee, written by Dennis Horn. But that's a good way to just get your feet wet, try to recognize a lot of the different wildflowers that are out there. It's not comprehensive. It doesn't have every wildflower, every plant, but it's a good way to start. I don't know if it's just native species that are in there or not, but it's a good way to just get familiar with the different plant families and different plant genus groups, to try to learn how the differences between the sunflower and other kinds of asters, for instance. But I think that's the best way to go. There are apps, several different apps that people use for plant identification. I've used iNaturalist a lot, which tends to be pretty accurate. And that's more for logging observations in the field. They also have an app called Seek that's purely for plant identification. For a lot of things that have flowers, it's pretty accurate a lot of time. So that's really helpful, and something easy to carry around in your pocket. So you don't have to have a book and flip through pages. And then as you get more familiar with that, you could get a more technical key, a plant key, to learn how to key plants out. You have anything to add, Murray?
No, that's well said.
KS, how would you go about encouraging city planners and fire marshals to allow prescribed burns as part of a land management plan and getting rid of invasives? And do you have a source for the foam component that is added to your herbicide?
Yes. Okay. On the foam components, we use an applicator, a hand sprayer from Green Shoots. greenshootesonline.com. I'll type that in, and you can get the foaming agent from there as well. And regarding the city administrators and fire marshal, so I guess this would be city government property that we're talking about. Yeah, that's a tough one. It's hard to get through a barrier that a lot of people put up with regards to fire. I suppose sharing effective research, publications, and presentations is the way to get through. Sharing results from, even in like our agency, you can look at what Natural Areas is doing to manage their land, or another city, something like that. But yeah, unfortunately, that's a real tough one. I think that a lot of the local fire marshals kind of overstep their bounds with the prescribed burning as it relates to approving it, because it's not really theirs to approve. The Division of Forestry is the lead agency on prescribed fire. And I understand that it can be an internal political battle with whatever city we're talking about sometimes. But the Division of Forestry has the final say on that. In Tennessee, prescribed fire is comparatively easy to do. There are a lot more state restrictions in other states, but not here, thankfully. So keep that in mind too when you get told no, we don't do that.
We actually did have a state forester that was going to do the prescribed burn for us, but then when he notified the fire people, the fire marshal said no. So he didn't try and fight it. And of course, we decided not to go that route either, because the property that we want to restore is private property, but it's within city limits. So anyway.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah. And, some counties will require like a clean air day to do it. And you have to document that, which is no big deal, but it's just, one more step in getting a permit approved for prescribed fire. Like I said, a lot of these kind of additions to the permit requirements are made up. They're not legally required. They don't have legal standing to do that. And I don't want to get into a world that I shouldn't be talking about as far as legal stuff, but just take that with a grain of salt.
Any last questions? I know we're kind of running out of time here, and we've got a ton more that people want to talk about. We will be sending out a follow-up email. We'll include these guys' email addresses and contact info if you guys want to, if everyone has other questions for them.
We'll send these questions along to them as well from the chat, and so they can think them over and respond to them. We'll include their answers.
Yeah, maybe a real quick one, Cooper. What hardiness zone are we in? And I assume when you say we're in, maybe just Nashville or Middle Tennessee.
Yeah, I think it's 6. I think it's 6B.
And someone had a great question about whether those zones were changing due to climate changes.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I bet they could eventually. I did notice this year when we were planting our garden that the earliest or the latest or last frost date had changed in the Farmer's Almanac.
Yeah.
And I can, when they send the email, I can send several links. I know there are questions about where to get seeds and plants. And I have some links I can share for that.
All right, Angela, anything else that we need to wrap up with?
We have recorded this, so you are live and on TV, and we will be posting that on our YouTube channel soon, so you can share it with all your friends, show that you're famous. Like I said, we will be sending out an email with everyone's, with these gentlemen's presentations, their contact information, their answers, all that sort of thing. And a survey. We'd love to get your feedback on ideas for future conservation conversations or anything we can do to improve this for you. Again, we've got tons of great questions, and we will try to get all those answered for you.
Also, the annual meeting is starting up in a few minutes. If you want to stick around and hear about some of our priorities, it'll be short, but even if you're not a member, you're welcome to join.